I love this quote. It's the economy, stupid. It was said by a guy named James Carville. He was the political strategist who got Bill Clinton elected president. And what he meant by this was is that often the chief political issue is the economy, right? And so whichever political candidate can either create the best economy or can convince people that he will be able to deliver the best economy will win the election, whatever that is. So, as we've done many times throughout our time together, we need a definition for an economy. Here is one. An economy is the system for the allocation of scarce resources which have alternative uses. What the heck does that mean? All right. Well, think about your time. Okay. Your time is a scarce resource. You don't know if you're going to live 80, 90, 100 years or be hit by a falling anvil tomorrow. You have no idea how much time you have. So it's scarce, and you only have so many hours in a day, and so many of those hours you have to spend sleeping and eating. And so you have even less time, right? So your time is very, very scarce. It is a scarce resource, and it has alternative uses. You can do anything with your time. You could go on a hike. You could learn to be an astronaut. You could read one of these books. You could learn to speak a foreign language. You could go outside and hit rocks with a mallet. You could build fireworks. You could pray. You could fast, right? You can do anything with your time. So when you think about how you spend your time, you are often thinking about how you economize your time. What is the system that you have created to allocate the scarce resource of your time, which has alternative uses? Now, every nation on earth has scarce resources. They only have so many ports. They only have so much land. They only have so much coal. They only have so much gas. They only have so much ozone. New Zealand, for example, has a thinner ozone than the rest of the world because there are so many sheep, and those sheep pass gas, and it has literally created a hole in the ozone of New York. As a filmmaker, or not of New York, New Zealand, as a filmmaker, one of the things I learned from watching the special features of The Lord of the Rings is that the sunlight in the nation of New Zealand is about a stop brighter than the sunlight anywhere else on Earth because of this. So every nation has scarce resources, and every nation can do anything with those scarce resources. I mean, if you are a nation and you have a lot of desert, okay, you could take the sand and you could turn the sand into glass, or you could turn it into silicon computer chips, or you could sell it for sandboxes, or you could start a religion and declare all the sun that is touched by the sand to be sacred sand that nobody can do anything with, right? You have to, every nation on earth has to economize its scarce resources with which it can do anything. And that even applies, by the way, to the nation's people. It can do anything with its people. It could kill them. It could enslave them. It could sell them to another nation. It could eat them. It could, right? Like, just think about all of the things that you can do with human beings. And it's a little bit dizzying and occasionally perhaps horrifying, some of those things that I mentioned. So these systems that nations develop are called different things. Often they end in ism, right? Capitalism, socialism, communism, distributivism. These are the systems that nations use to economize their scarce resources, which have alternative uses. Now, the Bible does not endorse a specific system. It doesn't describe one, which we'll get to. But first, let's talk big principles. There is a vital economic principle at the heart of the Ten Commandments. And when I think about economics, it's the first thing that comes into my mind. Then it's going to help narrow down some of these systems that are biblical. And it's the 10th commandment, thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not steal. What does that, the idea that you should not steal It presupposes, it assumes something. And that something is private property. If you don't own anything, I can't steal from you. If I don't own anything, you can't steal from me, because you can only steal something that somebody owns. So that biblical principle alone makes one of the systems, one of the economic systems that I mentioned a moment ago, completely unbiblical. And that is the economic system of communism. Communism takes all the scarce resources in a nation and declares that they are owned by everyone, and then seeks to distribute those scarce resources equitably. Okay? So often a euphemism for this is often the word public. So we talk about public ownership, like public transportation, right? The government owns it and distributes transportation via the bus route, right? Or public school. The government takes education and then distributes it. You know, it takes your tax dollars, converts those dollars into teachers and school buildings and school buses, and then everybody can go to those schools via those school buses and learn from those teachers for free, right? It's really just the price of your taxes, right? So you might think, when you think about communism, the government saying that everybody owns everything, well, you might say, hooray, this means that there's no theft, because the government nobody owns anything, right? So if we can't steal, if we can only steal things that people own and nobody owns anything, then wow, we've developed an economic system which has made it impossible to violate one of the 10 Commandments. Actually, what you have done is you have just put all the ownership in the hands of the government. So go try and steal a bus from a public transportation system, or go try and kidnap a teacher from a public school, and then in the courtroom trot out the defense, well, but I paid for it with my tax dollars. That ain't gonna work. You haven't created a system in which you have spread ownership. What you've actually done under communism is you create a system where you concentrate ownership. And it does not work. I mean, in fact, like, it really does not work. And it doesn't work in part because it violates the Bible. And whenever it doesn't work and wherever it hasn't worked, millions of people die. The statistics in the Soviet Union are sketchy because it was the Soviet Union. But historians estimate that Joseph Stalin alone, to say nothing of the revolution prior to him and to say nothing of the time period after him, but that Stalin alone was responsible for the deaths of between 7 and 20 million Russians. These were not people who died in World War II. These were people who died as a direct result of communist policy. These people starved to death, or they were just killed as the government enforced its totalitarian regime. Chairman Mao, it's estimated that he killed, just him, to say nothing of his predecessors, or postcessors? I don't know. He killed between 30 and 45 million people. Again, not a result of war. Mass starvation, mass death because of political opposition. I want to get something for you. A book. There it is. There's this awesome bit here. This is a book, The Gulag Archipelago. This is actually an abridged version. The real version, this was written by a man named Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was a Russian. He was in a gulag, a concentration camp. The reason he was there is because he fought for Russia in World War II. And he, when he returned, along with many of the other soldiers, he was imprisoned by the government he had just fought for because he had seen that they were lying. That they were lying about the West and that they were lying about communism. He had fought in Germany, he had fought in France, he had fought in Europe, and he had seen that the capitalist West was infinitely is hyperbole, but infinitely more prosperous than his own nation, which he was fighting to defend. And so, along with many of his fellow prisoners, he was put in a gulag. And he wrote this book, which won the Pulitzer Prize. He wrote this: "It has been known for centuries that hunger rules the world. Hunger rules every human being unless he has himself consciously decided to die. Hunger, which forces an honest person to reach out and steal. Hunger, which compels the most unselfish person to look with envy into someone else's bowl and to try painfully to estimate what weight of ration his neighbor is receiving. Hunger, which darkens the brain and refuses to allow it to be distracted by anything else at all, or to think about anything else at all, or to speak about anything else at all except food, food, and food. Hunger, from which it is impossible to escape even in dreams. Dreams are about food, and insomnia is over food, and soon just insomnia. Hunger, after which one cannot even eat up. The man has by then turned into a one-way pipe, and everything emerges from him in exactly the same state in which it was swallowed." That's what communism gets you. Communism, taken to its logical conclusion, destroys many of the 10 Commandments. The 6th and the 9th, "You shall not commit adultery, and you shall not covet your neighbor's wife." Marriage in communism is viewed as a polluted hierarchical institution. We mentioned hierarchy earlier. Communism, Marxism, which is the rubric in which communism exists, hates hierarchy. And so Karl Marx, in his Communist Manifesto, he foresaw the abolition of the family. In fact, I don't know if it's in here later in my notes, but Black Lives Matter had on its website. They took it down after there was a hue and cry, but because it's a Marxist organization and they've simply, communism is all about class consciousness, and BLM is all about race consciousness, but both of them exist in the rubric of Marxism. They also said on their website that they exist to destroy the nuclear family. The 7th commandment is destroyed by communism. We already talked about that. No stealing, because you can't steal things that people don't own. And then 10th commandment, "You shall not covet your neighbor's goods." Well, covetousness is the very heart of communism. Covetousness says, you have something I want. I'm going to get the government to take it from you and give it to me. That's communism. Communism, it went into hiding after Alexander Solzhenitsyn's book, after the victory in the Cold War, which Ronald Reagan led, but it's back now. Communism is back now, and it's wearing a little black dress and calling itself socialism. Communism says the government will own everything for your good, right? Socialism says the government will own everything for your neighbor's good, right? So it's evil sort of masquerading as the golden rule. I'm not going to love my neighbor. I'm not going to look across the street and see that the person needs help or is struggling in some way and go help them. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to get the government to take 60% of my taxes and 90% of that rich guy's taxes, and he's going to give that guy what he probably doesn't need anyway, right? That's socialism. Socialism is just communism wearing a little black dress. That's all it is. And they were founded in the idea, you probably wondered why I showed this to you earlier, but communism and socialism are founded in the idea that equitable treatment means we all end up at the same place. But what is the same place? Right? Does that mean everyone's a CEO? Does that mean everyone's the president? Does that mean everyone's Michael Jordan? Right? Some people don't want those jobs. Some people want to go sit in the woods and write poetry. Other people want to have 15 children. Other people, right? How in the world do you possibly have a system in which everyone winds up in the same place, right? Well, maybe the body count is a hint, you know? Everybody ends up in the same place in the grave, so maybe if you just kill enough of... Anyway, I shouldn't go there. All right, so that's enough about the bad systems. What about some good ones? When God set up Israel, he gave them an economic system, right, for their nation. And that system, I think, would be well defined as distributivism. The idea here is that capital was equally distributed. I'm going to define capital here in just a second, but God gave out parcels of land for each tribe according to its population. You could buy and you could sell your land, but every 7 years there was to be an event called the Year of Jubilee, in which everything would revert to its original owners. So everyone would have access to land, or what we today would call capital. Capital is the means of production. It's whatever you need to produce what you need to be alive. So in ancient Israel, basically everybody was a farmer, right? Some people weren't farmers, or a few tradespeople, a few merchants, but basically everyone is a farmer. And so those people, in order to make what they needed land. They needed land for their sheep and their goats to graze so that they could drink the milk and they could eat the meat and they could make the leather that would form the tents and form their clothing and all of that stuff. So their land was what they needed to make what they needed to be alive. We don't need land anymore, generally speaking, in order to provide what we need to be alive here in the United States. What we need here to be alive is money. Money is what we use to buy what we need. So capital is whatever we use to produce our money. So people who own their own stuff, like welders who owns his own welding equipment, electricians who owns his own tools, photographers who own their own cameras, writers who own their own pen and their own paper. All of these people are capitalists, right? Anyone who owns what they use to make what they need is a capitalist. So it is not just the super rich, okay? When sometimes you hear people talk about capitalists and you think of venture capitalists in Silicon Valley or the people on Shark Tank who have bajillions of dollars, right? It's just that money is the most flexible capital. Let's say you're a photographer and you work for a photography studio, and so you don't own your lights, you don't own your camera, you don't own any of this stuff. The photography studio owns it. But let's say you have money in the bank. Well, if you lose your job at the photography studio, or perhaps you decide to strike out on your own, you take that money in the bank, your capital, and you convert it into lights and cameras, which you then use to take pictures, which you sell to get money to buy your food. So you are a capitalist when you own your own lights and your own camera and your own stuff that you use to make what you need to be alive. You are not a capitalist when you're a guy who shows up at the photography studio and doesn't own anything. And you're in deep trouble if when you get fired, you don't have the money to buy your own stuff. This is really interesting because this means that most of Jesus's disciples were capitalists. They owned their fishing boats and their nets, which they used to acquire the fish, some of which they ate, most of which they sold. They then used that money to buy bread, to buy housing, to buy clothing, to buy whatever. Capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit. So again, the photographer who owns his own stuff, right? He controls it. He's a private owner, and he controls it for profit. He then uses that profit to purchase his food, to purchase his housing, to purchase all these things. This also means Jesus was a capitalist. He was a carpenter. He owned his own tools. He made yokes. He then sold those yokes for profit. He then took that profit and he bought food. This doesn't mean that capitalism is the most biblical system, right? At the very least, it just means that it isn't sinful because Jesus committed no sin and Jesus was a capitalist who made and sold things for profit. So these things aren't sinful. At the most, I think what it does mean is that there's something natural in human flourishing to the idea of me making something that you need and selling it to you. That contributes to human flourishing. That contributes to community, right? I made this video for you. I'm not profiting off of it, but I made this video for you. You are receiving it, right? A photographer takes pictures of your wedding. She does that for you. You receive those photographs, and to say thank you to her, you provide her money, which she then uses on the things that she needs. But if we're buying and selling stuff for profit, how much do we charge, right? This is a big question, and the Bible says a lot about it. There are repeated instructions not to have just scales. So do not be unfair in measurements of length, weight, or volume. You are to have honest balances, honest weights, an honest dry measure, and an honest liquid measure. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Keep all my statutes and all my ordinances and do them. I am the Lord. Do not have differing weights in your bag, one heavy and one light. Do not have differing dry measures in your house, a larger and a smaller. You must have a full and honest weight, a full and honest dry measure, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Honest balances and scales are the Lord's. All the weights in the bag are his concern. So in biblical times, when this was written, the way pricing worked was you had weights, and so much weight equaled so much gold, right? And so you'd put your weight on a scale and you'd measure out the spice, or you'd measure out the wool, or you'd measure out the meat. And so if you cheated and you shaved your weight a little bit, right, you could steal, right? And so this is what this is talking about. So obviously, biblically, it is possible for there to be exploitative pricing, right? You can rip people off in actual fact. And so I love this quote from Thomas Sowell. So what is a price? He says, prices are like messengers conveying news. Their primary role is to provide financial incentives to affect behavior in the use of resources and the resulting products. Prices, in a sense, can summarize the end result of a complex reality in a simple number. So I've got an iPad here, right? This iPad cost me a certain number of dollars. Let's say $500. And those $500 that this iPad costs me tells me something. It gives me knowledge. First of all, that's a lot of money. I mean, this is not a big device, right? It's pretty small. So that price communicates to me that whatever this is, it's complicated because it's a small thing that costs a lot of money. If I sit down and think about it, I also realize, wow, like there's a lot of different kind of parts in this thing, you know? There's metal and there's glass and there's lithium for the battery and there's plastic for the cover. There's all kinds of different stuff. And all those things probably came from all over the world and then had to be shipped somewhere. They had to be turned into stuff and they had to be put together. And so there's an enormous amount that $500 that this iPad cost communicates to me. It's also rather astonishing once you think about that it's so cheap. I mean, yes, $500 is an enormous amount of money, but to hold in my hand, I think it weighs less than a pound, a device with literally billions of times the computing power of the computer that put astronauts on the moon, suddenly that $500 seems like chump change. So that $500 summarizes the end result of a very complex reality into a single number. So let's talk about another policy. We've kind of talked about some policies with the economic system of capitalism and distributivism and things like that, but let's get a little more specific. And in defense of myself, I generated this material before Vice President Harris announced that these are things she was in favor of. So I didn't invent this just to slam on her. It just happened that way. Because she believes that the idea is for everybody to end up in the same place. So of course she would think these things. All right. Anyway, we digress. Everybody remembers COVID. Sadly, we remember COVID. Why couldn't you buy toilet paper during COVID? Why couldn't you do that? Why was toilet paper a scarce resource, which doesn't really have alternative uses? But why was that scarce resource difficult to find? It was difficult to find because price gouging, I'll explain why I put that in quotes in a moment. Price gouging is illegal in most places. In other words, the government blocked the price of toilet paper from reflecting the complex reality of the coronavirus pandemic into a single number. If that had not been the case, if the government had not prevented price gouging of toilet paper, then what would have happened? The pandemic would have hit, and the price of toilet paper and a number of other goods, which were in short supply, like sanitizing wipes and things like that, those prices would have skyrocketed. Why would they have skyrocketed? Well, because there was a very complex reality, and that complex reality was a global pandemic. And so suddenly shipping became very difficult. Suddenly manufacturing became very difficult. The companies that are making these products suddenly have to provide new personal protective equipment for all their employees. So their prices are increasing, right? On top of all of that, there's suddenly enormous demand for toilet paper, right? And so the prices should have skyrocketed. What would have happened if the prices of toilet paper had skyrocketed during the pandemic? People would not have stockpiled because they would have walked into the store and they would have looked at toilet paper, and even though they're panicky on the inside about how they're going to wipe during the pandemic, right? They would have looked at the complex reality summarized in a single number of, let's say, $1,000 or $100 for a pack of toilet paper. And they would have said to themselves, I'm not that worried. I got some spare rolls at home. And they wouldn't have bought it. And then the person who actually needed toilet paper during the pandemic, who was legitimately out of toilet paper, would have been able to buy it. It's kind of silly to talk about toilet paper in a pandemic, but it isn't silly when suddenly you're talking about flashlights in a hurricane and power is out and it's 2 o'clock in the morning and someone from your house, someone in your family is buried somewhere in the rubble of your basement and you need a flashlight and you go to the local gas station to buy a flashlight, but you can't, because price gouging is illegal. And so the first guy, the first prepper who swung through there, bought all the flashlights because they were still $3.99. How much would you be willing to pay for a flashlight in that moment to rescue your family member trapped under the rubble of a hurricane in the dead of night? That's the problem with this idea of what's called price controls. Going in and locking down the prices of things and saying, no, you're not allowed to charge that much for that product. Well, the person who's saying that, they don't have enough information to be able to make that call. This happened in the Soviet Union, right, under communism. One of my favorite examples was, for whatever reason, the government needed mole skins. Okay? They needed mole skins. And so they set the price. They said, we are going to charge X, we are not going to charge, we are going to pay people X number of dollars for them to give us their moleskins, which we will then turn into, I don't know, boots or journals if those things are actually made out of moleskins. I don't know. But anyway, they said, we will pay everybody $10 for every moleskin. Well, the people of Russia, who were all starving and impoverished, went berserk and killed all the moles. And the system was flooded with moleskins. There were so many moleskins. There was so much more moleskins that they literally had warehouses of moleskins because people were, and they had to pay everybody 10 rubles, right, for all these moleskins. And then 3/4 of them all went to rot because they were attempting to control the price. They were not letting the market dictate things. Here's another quote from Thomas Sowell. He's awesome. He's like 95 years old. He's a professor at Stanford. He said, "People who want special taxes or subsidies for particular things seem not to understand that what they are really asking for is for the prices to misstate the relative scarcities of things and the relative values that the users of these things put on them." That emphasis there, that italicized misstate, that's his emphasis, not mine. This idea of having these special taxes, these special subsidies, telling corporations, you can't charge that much money for toilet paper, right? It's an unjust weight. It's an unjust weight. It's the government coming in and putting its thumb on the scale and saying, you're not allowed to make that much money on toilet paper. You're not allowed to make that much money on prescription drug prices. You're not allowed to make that much money on rent, right? It is an unjust scale. So, first policy, immigration. Second policy, here's an economic idea for you. We should vote against candidates who are in favor of unjust scales. And we should vote for politicians in favor of just scales. We should vote for politicians who will let the market, who will let the complex realities of the market get translated into prices. And then the individuals who show up to buy that toilet paper for $100 can make the decision themselves about whether or not they want to buy it. But one way or another, the scarce resource of toilet paper will be allocated. And so if you lock it down and you say you can't charge any more than $3 for toilet paper, well then, the first thing that will happen is all the preppers will come in and buy it all up. The government will realize this is happening, so then the second thing that will happen is, and you saw it during the pandemic, is then the government institutes silly little things like you can only buy one thing of toilet paper per person. And how did that work out? Not great, because you buy it, you go home, you send your wife, she buys it, she comes home, you go back, you buy it. It doesn't work, right? The only thing that actually works is letting the complex reality of the market get summarized into a single number, and then you let people make choices based on that. Anything else is an unjust weight, and it is not biblical, and we should not vote for it.